Today on Better Book Clubs, tips for reading To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. To the Lighthouse is one of Virginia Woolf's most famous novels, the other one being Mrs. Dalloway. And she's also very well known for her series of lectures titled A Room of One's Own. That series of lectures that Woolf delivered was about the importance of having a space of your own and money of your own as a woman if you were going to be a writer. And of course also metaphorically having a space of your own, being respected as a writer. In fact, Woolf herself was one of the first women writers to become recognized as part of the Western canon. She was writing in the early part of the 20th century, and she was part of a famous group of writers and artists known as the Bloomsbury Group in London. Among the other members of that group was her eventual husband, Leonard Woolf, who also became her publisher. The two of them together owned a publishing house. So she was quite successful as a woman writer, but she knew how hard it was for women to be taken seriously as writers. That idea comes up in To the Lighthouse along with so many other ideas. This is a book of ideas. It's a short little book, but it's not an easy read. And so today I'm going to give you a few tips on reading To the Lighthouse. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about the novel itself. To the Lighthouse was published kind of midway through her career in 1927. It takes place on the Isle of Skye off the coast of Scotland. It tells the story of the Ramsay family and their guests who are staying at their sizable summer cottage on the island in the summer season. So I'm doing this tips video because it was the book that you selected in the last poll that I posted. It's the book that you said you wanted some tips on. So I went back and read it for the first time in decades. And it was a really interesting experience for me to reread it in order to make this video because I remembered some bits and pieces of it, and I sort of remembered the gist of it. But I connected this time through with the protagonist, Mrs. Ramsay, in a way that I hadn't when I read it in probably my 20s. So I really enjoyed rereading this novel, but I know that it's going to pose some challenges for readers. So here are a few tips for you if you want to read To the Lighthouse. The first one is about expectations. So if you're entering this novel with an expectation of a plot, you're probably going to be disappointed. The novel is broken into 3 separate sections, and that's another thing that's a little bit unexpected because they're not at all of equal length, and they're not even doing the same kind of thing. So the first section is the longest, and it's sort of a little slice of life. It all takes place in one very compressed period of time, a single day. The focus of a lot of the conversation has to do with whether they're going to be able to go to the lighthouse or not. This little boy, Mrs. Ramsay's little boy, his name is James, really wants to go to the lighthouse. I think he's 6 years old. And so it's a topic of conversation. The lighthouse is pretty far away across the water and the weather doesn't look like it's going to cooperate. So in a very superficial way, that's the plot of the day. But what really happens is that you get to know these characters because To the Lighthouse is a very interior book. In fact, Leonard Woolf called it a psychological poem. And I think that's a really great explanation or description of it. And if you keep that idea in mind entering the novel, I think you'll enjoy it a lot more because you're not expecting it to be something that it's not. So then also the expectations that you might have about structure are going to be undermined. The second section of the book is very short and essentially almost has no characters in it. It's really about the house itself during the time when nobody's there. And so it's a really fascinating little section. I really enjoyed reading it. And then the third section of the novel takes place quite a bit later, and the family is back at the house, and they're going to finally make it out to the lighthouse, which is not a spoiler because this is really not a plot-based novel. Another thing that's really challenging about To the Lighthouse is the long, convoluted sentence structure. So from the very first page, I found myself working at following the train of thought through these long sentences. They're not all like that, But just come into the novel prepared to do a little bit of work. There were definitely sentences where I read it and then I had to back up, or I didn't even get to the end of it and I had to back up and work on it again. You have to be aware of the clauses and the pronouns, what's referring to whom, and just kind of be willing to put in a little bit of work to follow those sentences. The reason the sentences are like that is because Virginia Woolf is doing something called stream of consciousness. She's paying attention to and trying to replicate what our thoughts might look like if they were put down on the page. And that's really tricky because sometimes we're doing one thing and thinking something else, and she's trying to show the characters doing that, sometimes doing one thing but thinking something else, or their thoughts being interrupted, or their thoughts wandering. And so that's why those sentences are the way they are, because that helps to kind of construct the way our thoughts really work internally, rather than the somewhat false way we tend to put sentences down on the page to make them more readable. Another function of this stream of consciousness is also that time keeps shifting. And it's not flashbacks that you're going to experience, although it feels a little bit like that, but it's people's imaginations. So Mrs. Ramsay may be looking across the lawn and thinking about one thing, and then she sees something that reminds her of something that happened earlier, and you're going to follow her train of thought back into a memory of something that happened, but she's actually still in a moment physically, and you're going to see some shifting back and forth happening. So that's also difficult to follow, but it helps to realize that's what's happening. When you come into the novel, understand that that's what's happening, and knowing that makes it a lot easier to read. There's also a very typical challenge in To the Lighthouse, which we run across in lots of novels, and that is just the sheer number of characters. So Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay have 8 children and a whole bunch of house guests. Their names are just going to get thrown out in the beginning of the novel, and you're just sort of expected to know who these people are because there's not some fake omniscient narrator explaining everything to you. You're inside the heads of not just Mrs. Ramsay, but some of the other characters as well. And so they're not going to stop and explain to you who these people are. They're just going to use their names. So you have to do a little bit of work too to figure out who's who. So as I always suggest, when we run across this problem with characters, I just kept a little list as I was going, and it didn't take too long to catch on to the cast of characters. So all of these suggestions I'm making may be discouraging and make you think, oh, I don't know, maybe this book is too much trouble, but trust me, it's not. This is a classic of early 20th century literature, and there's a reason for that. First of all, what Woolf is doing in this stream of consciousness inside the imaginations of the characters writing is something really unique that we honestly don't see very often. So it's a really interesting experience as a reader. This is a classic novel that once you've read it, you'll have in your repertoire. Also, Woolf's physical descriptions, just the quality of her writing, are really beautiful. And they're not sentimental, but the language itself is really rich. So keep in mind this novel takes place on the coast, and there are lots of really beautifully written passages about the sea. Here's one of them. For the great plateful of blue water was before her, the hoary lighthouse, distant, austere in the midst. And on the right, as far as the eye could see, fading and falling in soft low pleats, the green sand dunes with the wild flowing grasses on them, which always seemed to be running away into some moon country, uninhabited of men. I'm often making the argument to you that beautiful writing is a reason to read a lot of novels, but the primary reason I think that To the Lighthouse is worth reading is the depth of the characters and how well we get to know them, and especially the things that they're thinking are still so relevant to us. So this psychological novel doesn't just tap into the characters, who you get to know very well, at least some of them, but it taps into us as well. So I hope you'll give Virginia Woolf's novel To the Lighthouse a try. It's an amazing read. I'm posting another poll in the community section below where you can vote on the next tips video that you'd like me to make. There'll be 4 classic novels to choose from, so take a look and place your vote for the next tips video. If you like what you see here, please subscribe, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.